A homeless mother, desperate and out of options, stands at the gates of a millionaire's mansion, begging for shelter. But when the owner steps forward, he freezes, because the woman before him isn't just any stranger. She's his first love, the one he lost long ago. How did she end up here? And what? Secrets from their past still linger, waiting to be uncovered. As their worlds collide once more, a painful truth emerges, one that will force him to face the choices that shaped both their lives. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. This is yet another powerful story from Golden Stories, where we bring you emotional tales that make you reflect on life. Elijah's small hands trembled as he tightened his grip around the thick, salt-crusted rope, pulling in the heavy fishing net from the water. The weight of the morning's catch fought against him, the slippery bodies of the fish thrashing inside the mesh. His muscles screamed in protest, but he knew better than to stop. Frank Dawson sat on an overturned wooden crate a few feet away, chewing on a piece of tobacco, his beady eyes fixed on the boy with the same cold indifference he always had. "Don't just stand there, boy. Pull harder," Frank barked, spitting onto the sand. Elijah didn't argue. He never did. He gritted his teeth and pulled, his bare feet digging into the damp earth for leverage. This was his life, working from dawn till dusk for a man who never once said thank you, never once treated him as anything more than a tool to be used. And yet, Elijah had no choice. The fish he received at the end of the day were the only thing keeping his mother and baby sister from going to bed hungry. The sun beat down mercilessly as Elijah dragged the last of the nets onto the shore, his thin frame sagging under the weight of exhaustion. Frank stood and inspected the haul, his wrinkled face twisting into a scowl. "Not enough," he grunted, kicking at one of the fish with the toe of his boot. "You're getting lazy, boy." Elijah swallowed the lump of frustration in his throat. Lazy? He had been up since before the sun, wading through knee-deep water, untangling the nets, sorting fish, lifting crates too heavy for a child his age. But he knew better than to talk back. Frank was the only one willing to give him work, and work meant food. Instead, Elijah lowered his head and murmured, "I can go back out and check the traps again, sir." Frank scoffed, wiping his hands on his tattered vest. "You'd better, and don't take all day about it." With that, he turned his back on Elijah, already counting the coins he'd make from selling the fish the boy had pulled in with his own hands. Elijah ran back to the water, his body aching with every step. He didn't have the luxury of slowing down. He couldn't afford to rest. His mother Monica was waiting at home, her tired eyes full of quiet worry, her hands calloused from washing clothes for the wealthier townspeople. And Lily, his little sister, barely 5 years old, depended on him. He thought of her tiny face, her innocent giggles, despite the emptiness in her stomach, and he pushed forward. The traps were set further out, where the water reached his chest. He plunged in without hesitation, his hands moving quickly, untangling seaweed from the wooden frames, searching for anything worth bringing back. A few small fish wriggled. Inside, not much, but enough to help. He stuffed them into his bucket, already dreading the way Frank would sneer at his haul. It didn't matter. He had to try. By the time Elijah returned to shore, his legs felt like they would give out beneath him. Frank barely glanced at the new catch before letting out a disgusted snort. "Pathetic," he muttered. He picked up one of the fish between his thick fingers, examined it as if it personally offended him, then tossed it back into the bucket. "You'll get half of what you usually take home. Maybe that'll teach you not to waste my time." Elijah's stomach twisted. Half? That meant his mother would eat even less tonight. That meant Lily would have to sleep with an empty belly. "Please, sir," Elijah started, but the look Frank shot him made his words die in his throat. The old fisherman's face was a storm of irritation and contempt, the deep lines on his forehead deepening as he leaned in. "You don't get to beg, boy," he growled. "You take what I give you, and if you don't like it, you can find someone else fool enough to hire you." But they both knew there was no one else. Elijah clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay quiet. He couldn't afford to make Frank angry. If he got kicked out, his family would starve. So he nodded, swallowing every bit of pride left in him, and picked up the few fish he was allowed to take. As he turned to leave, Frank's voice rang out again, sharp and mocking. "You'll be back tomorrow, and don't. And think about slacking off again." Elijah didn't answer. He just walked away, his feet dragging through the sand, his heart heavy with frustration and exhaustion. Tomorrow would be the same, and the day after, and the day after that, until, somehow, something changed. But for now, all he could do was survive. "You work slower than a damn turtle, boy. Move!" Frank's voice cut through the air like the sharp edge of a rusted blade, carrying with it the same bitterness that had been part of his every word since Sam could remember. The old man stood near the fishing crates, arms crossed, face twisted in that familiar scowl of dissatisfaction. Elijah, his small frame barely able to lift the bucket of fish, didn't respond. He just kept moving, head down, arms shaking from exhaustion. Sam leaned against the wooden railing of the dock, watching. He had seen his father angry plenty of times, had heard him yell at customers, at the sea, at the fish themselves. But this was different. There was something in the way Frank's voice dropped when he spoke to Elijah, something colder, like he wasn't yelling at a boy, but at something beneath him. Sam had never paid much attention to the kid before, but now, as he watched Elijah flinch every time Frank so much as looked at him, he felt a twinge of discomfort settle in his gut. Elijah lifted the bucket onto the wooden table where Frank sorted the fish, his thin arms shaking under the weight. Frank barely looked at him before waving a dismissive hand. "Half of these are useless. You don't check the nets properly, you don't get paid properly," he grunted, tossing a small fish back into the water. Elijah nodded, as if he expected nothing more, and stepped back. Sam narrowed his eyes. His father wasn't a kind man, he never had been, but there was something about the way he treated Elijah that didn't sit right. Frank was rough with everyone, but the way he spoke to the boy, the way his lip curled every time he looked at him, felt different. Sam watched as Elijah lowered his head, pressing his lips together as if swallowing whatever words he wanted to say. He never argued. He never defended himself, and Frank never looked at him the way he looked at Sam or even the other men in the village. It wasn't just anger or impatience. It was something deeper. "Why do you talk to him like that?" The words left Sam's mouth before he could think. Twice. Frank turned, his eyes narrowing, as if noticing for the first time that his son had been standing there. "Like what?" he asked, his tone as sharp as the gutting knife in his hand. Sam shifted his weight, glancing at Elijah, who was already stepping away, avoiding their gaze. "Like he's a damn stray dog," Sam muttered, kicking at a loose plank on the dock. He wasn't sure why he said it, but the more he watched, the clearer it became. Elijah worked harder than anyone, but Frank treated him worse than the dirt under his boots. Frank's expression darkened, his jaw tightening. "Boy, you don't know a damn thing about how the world works," he said, pointing the knife at Sam as if that ended the discussion. "Some people are meant to work. Others are meant to give orders. You do what you're told, and so does he." Sam clenched his fists, the unease in his stomach turning into something heavier. He wanted to push back, to argue, but he knew his father. Frank didn't explain himself. He didn't justify his actions. What he said was law, and questioning him only made things worse. Elijah didn't react. He just kept working, hauling another bucket, eyes fixed on the ground like he wasn't even there. Sam exhaled, shaking his head. He had never cared much about Elijah before, never thought about him beyond the fact that he was always there, always working, always silent. But now that he was paying attention, he couldn't unsee it. The way Elijah never complained, never asked for more than what Frank begrudgingly gave him. The way Frank's voice carried a bite that wasn't there when he spoke to anyone else. The way Elijah took it all, not because he wanted to, but because he had to. As the morning dragged on, Sam found himself watching more closely. He noticed how Frank never lifted a finger to help, how Elijah carried all the weight, how his hands were raw from the rope burns of the nets. He noticed how other fishermen in the village barely acknowledged the boy, how he was invisible except when someone needed work done. And most of all, he noticed how Frank's expression never changed when he looked at Elijah, like he wasn't looking at a person at all. Sam swallowed hard, rubbing the back of his neck. He didn't know what to do with the feeling gnawing at him, the realization that his father wasn't just tough, he was cruel. And for the first time in his life, Sam wasn't sure if he could just ignore it. "Get the nets up, boy, unless you plan on feeding your damn family with air." Frank's voice came sharp, cutting through the morning as Elijah hurried to obey. He was used to Frank's mood swings, but today was different. The old man had woken up meaner than usual, barking orders with an edge that made Elijah's stomach knot. His hands trembled as he pulled at the thick, tangled ropes, the damp fibers biting into his skin. He dared not look at Frank, but he could feel the weight of the man's glare pressing down on him. "Slower every damn day," Frank muttered, spitting over the side of the boat. "Like a parasite, sucking up what ain't yours." Elijah swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the net. He knew better than to respond, knew that anything he said would only make things worse. The boat rocked gently as Frank stood, his boots thudding against the wooden deck. "Look at you," he "Look at," sneered, shaking his head. "Weak, slow, worthless." Elijah forced himself to keep working, even as the insults struck like stones against his ribs. This wasn't new. Frank had always treated him like dirt, but today the anger in his voice carried something heavier, something uglier. "You think I don't think I see it?" Frank continued, stepping closer. "How you take and take, the fish I let you keep, the work I let you do, like I owe you something, like you belong here." Elijah's hands paused for just a second, his breath catching. Frank's face twisted. "That's right. You don't. You don't belong. Anywhere." Elijah kept his head down, but inside panic bubbled. Frank's rage wasn't just words today, it was something else, something dangerous. The boat drifted further from shore, the horizon stretching endlessly around them. No one to see, no one to stop him. "You don't even understand, do you?" Frank growled, his voice rising. "You're a burden, a leech. You think just 'cause you show up every damn day, I'm supposed to feel grateful, that I should pat you on the back and say, 'Good job, boy.'" He let out a bitter laugh. "You ain't nothing but a damn problem. Always have been." Elijah's pulse, Elijah's pounded in his ears. He gripped the net tighter, his knuckles white. He wanted to tell Frank he didn't expect anything, that he only took what he needed to keep his family alive. But the words wouldn't come. Then, before Elijah could react, Frank lunged. A rough hand grabbed the front of his shirt, yanking him up from the deck with shocking force. Elijah gasped, hands flailing as Frank dragged him toward the edge of the boat. "You want to take from me, huh? Let's see how much you can take." His breath reeked of tobacco and salt, his fingers digging into Elijah's thin shoulders. Elijah's mind raced. Was this a threat? Another cruel joke? But the look in Frank's eyes sent ice through his veins. This was real. This was happening. "You're nothing, boy, and I don't need nothing weighing me down." With a brutal shove, Frank threw him overboard. Elijah barely had time to scream before the ocean swallowed him whole. The water closed over Elijah's head like a heavy, suffocating blanket. The shock of the fall sent panic surging through his chest as salt water filled his nose and burned his throat. He kicked wildly, fighting to reach the surface, but the weight of his soaked clothes dragged him down. His arms flailed, desperate for something, anything to hold on to. When he finally broke through, gasping for air, his eyes darted frantically toward the boat. It was still there, bobbing gently in the water. But Frank wasn't reaching for him. He wasn't throwing a rope or yelling for him to grab hold. He was just standing there, staring down at him with a look Elijah had never seen before. Cold, detached, like he had already decided Elijah was gone. Elijah's limbs burned as he struggled to keep himself afloat. "Mr. Frank," he sputtered, coughing up seawater. "Please." His voice was raw, his throat aching from the salt and fear. He kicked harder, trying to move toward the boat, but the waves kept pushing him back. Frank didn't move, didn't speak. He simply watched. Then, without a word, he turned his back. Elijah's stomach clenched in terror. He had expected anger, punishment, maybe even a cruel beating. But this was worse. Frank wasn't just teaching him a lesson. He was leaving him to die. The boat shifted slightly as Frank walked toward the oars. Elijah's heart pounded as he saw the old man grab them, setting them into place. No, 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 no. Wait! Elijah cried, kicking harder. Please, I'll do better, I'll work harder. Just don't leave me here. His voice cracked, his small body trembling from the cold. Frank didn't even glance back. With steady movements, he began rowing. The boat slowly drifted away, further from Elijah's reach. He lunged forward, his arms slicing through the water, but it was useless. Frank was leaving. He was actually leaving. Elijah's strength was fading. His limbs felt heavier with every stroke, his chest tightening as exhaustion set in. He had never been this far out before, never had to fight the ocean on his own. He wasn't sure how much longer he could last. The village was nothing but a blur in the distance, too far to swim, too far to even hope for help. Tears mixed with the salt water on his face as he fought against the sinking feeling in his gut. Not just the fear of drowning, but the realization that Frank had never seen him as anything more than trash to be tossed away. As the boat grew smaller and smaller, Elijah's desperate gasps turned into sobs. His body ached, his arms barely able to keep him afloat. He didn't know what was worse, the burning in his lungs or the betrayal cutting deeper than any wound ever could. He thought of his mother, his little sister waiting for him at home. They wouldn't even know what had happened. They'd just wait and wait, until waiting turned into mourning. His head dipped beneath the waves, and for the first time, he wondered if he would ever see them again. Elijah gasped as the cold water enveloped him, his body plunging into the depths before he even had time to process what had happened. His arms flailed, his legs kicked frantically, but the weight of his soaked clothes dragged him downward. The salt stung his eyes as he struggled to see, his heartbeat pounding against his ribs like a war drum. He forced himself upward, breaking through the surface with a desperate gasp, sucking in air before another wave crashed over him. He sputtered, coughing violently, his small body twisting as he fought against the pull of the sea. "Frank!" he screamed, his voice raw with panic. His eyes darted wildly, searching for the boat. It was still close, rocking gently in the distance, but it was moving away. Frank sat at the oars, rowing steadily, his back turned. He wasn't looking. He wasn't coming back. A jolt of terror shot through Elijah's chest as reality slammed into him with more force than the waves dragging him under. Frank had left him. He had really left him. This wasn't punishment. This wasn't a lesson. This was death. "Please!" Elijah shouted again, kicking harder, trying to push himself forward. His arms ached, the burning muscles threatening to give out, but he refused to stop. "Please don't leave me here." The boat kept drifting. The figure inside it never turned. Elijah's breath came in ragged, shallow gulps as the ocean pulled at him, dragging him in all directions. He tried to swim, tried to move forward, but the currents worked against him, swallowing every inch he gained. He wasn't getting closer. He was sinking. The realization hit him like a weight, pressing down on his chest. He was too far. He wasn't strong enough. His limbs burned with exhaustion, the frantic movements slowing as his energy drained. His heart pounded so hard it felt like it would explode. Every muscle in his body screamed, but the fight was slipping away. His head went under again, the salty water rushing into his nose, filling his lungs. He kicked desperately, pushing upward, breaking through just long enough to gasp for another breath before the sea claimed him again. His vision blurred, the world tilting. The boat was smaller now, further. Frank had disappeared into the distance, just a shadow on the horizon. Elijah felt the panic morph into something worse. helplessness. He had spent years fighting to survive, struggling for every scrap of food, every ounce of dignity, and now it didn't matter, because the ocean didn't care how hard he fought. It was stronger. It had already decided. His arms barely moved now, his strength draining with every passing second. His body was so cold, so heavy. He dipped beneath the waves again, longer this time, his chest tightening as his lungs screamed for air. When he surfaced, it wasn't with a desperate gasp. It was with a quiet, shuddering exhale. The boat was gone. He was alone, completely, utterly alone. The weight of it settled over him, pressing him deeper. The world above the water and the world below blurred together. He couldn't fight anymore. His body betrayed him, limbs going still as the current coiled around him like a living thing, pulling him into the deep. His eyes drifted closed, his thoughts growing distant, fading. His mother's face flashed in his mind, his sister's laugh. He had promised them he'd come home, but promises didn't mean anything when the ocean decided otherwise. Darkness wrapped around him as he sank, deeper and deeper, his last breath slipping from his lips in a stream of tiny bubbles. Sam's grip tightened around the wooden edge of the dock as he watched the small boat in the distance. His father had been acting strange all morning, short-tempered, more aggressive than usual. Sam had felt something was off, an unease that crawled up his spine the moment Frank and Elijah set off. That's why he had followed. He had stolen a glance at the old battered rowboat tied behind the fishery and made the decision in seconds. Now, watching from afar, he saw the moment everything changed. Frank stood at the edge of his boat, towering over Elijah. Sam's heart pounded as he watched his father's hands grab the boy's shirt, yanking him forward. Then, without hesitation, Frank shoved him. The splash reached Sam's ears, even from where he hid. His stomach lurched. His father didn't throw things overboard for fun. He threw them away. For a second, Sam expected Frank to pull the boy back, to bark out some cruel lesson about obedience. But Frank just sat down. He didn't throw a rope. He didn't hesitate. He simply started rowing back, leaving Elijah behind. Sam's chest tightened as he watched Elijah's small head break through the waves, arms flailing desperately. He was calling, out fighting against the pull of the water, but Frank never looked back. Sam gritted his teeth so hard his jaw ached. This wasn't punishment. This wasn't some lesson. His father had left Elijah to die. His body moved before his mind had even caught up. He spun around, sprinting toward the small rowboat he had untied earlier. His fingers fumbled with the oars, adrenaline surging through him as he shoved off, the boat lurching forward. He didn't think about what would happen next. He didn't care. He only knew one thing. He had to get to Elijah before it was too late. His arms burned as he rowed, the muscles in his shoulders screaming from the effort, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Elijah's head dipped beneath the water again, disappearing for too long before surfacing with a weak gasp. He was losing strength. Sam pushed harder, his mind racing. He had never seen anyone fight for their life before, not like this. He wasn't sure if Elijah even saw him coming, wasn't sure if the boy could hear anything over the waves swallowing him whole. "Hold on!" Sam shouted, his voice raw with desperation. "I'm coming!" He wasn't sure if Elijah heard, but he kicked weakly, his fingers barely keeping him afloat. Sam clenched his jaw, digging the oars deeper into the water. Every second mattered. If he was too slow, he wouldn't let himself finish the thought. As he reached Elijah, he let the oars drop, lunging forward, his hands gripping onto the boy's arm. Elijah barely responded, his body limp, skin ice-cold beneath Sam's fingers. "I got you!" Sam grunted, pulling with everything he had. Elijah didn't resist. He couldn't. His small frame was dead weight, his body exhausted from the fight. Sam hooked his arm under Elijah's and with one final heave dragged him into the boat. The boy collapsed onto the wooden boards, his chest heaving, water pouring from his mouth as he coughed violently. Sam knelt beside him, his own breath coming in short gasps. "You're okay," he said, though he wasn't sure if that was true. Elijah was shaking, his breaths ragged and shallow, but he was alive. Sam let out a shaky exhale, his hands still gripping the sides of the boat, his mind reeling. His father had left him. His father had tried to kill him. Sam's fists clenched as he turned back toward the shore, where Frank's boat was nothing more than a distant shadow. His pulse hammered. In his ears, as realization set in, this wasn't just about Elijah anymore. This was about who his father really was. And after today, Sam knew one thing for sure. He would never see him the same way again. Monica's eyes widened in horror the moment she saw Sam carrying Elijah toward their small home. Her hands flew to her mouth as she ran forward, her feet barely touching the ground. Lily, who had been playing in the dirt outside, looked up and froze, her little hands gripping the hem of her mother's dress. "Elijah?" Monica's voice cracked as she reached for her son, her fingers trembling as they touched his soaked clothes, his limp body. Sam barely had time to explain before Monica pulled Elijah into her arms, cradling him as if she could shield him from whatever nightmare he had just escaped. "What happened?" she demanded, her voice sharp with panic. Elijah coughed weakly, his small body shuddering against hers. Sam swallowed hard, his own breath still uneven from the long row back to shore. His hands were shaking, but not from exhaustion, from rage. Monica held Elijah's face between her hands, her eyes scanning him for injuries. "Baby, talk to me," she pleaded, brushing his wet hair back. Elijah's lips parted, but no words came out. He just looked at her, his dark eyes hollow, lost. Sam felt a weight settle in his chest. The kid hadn't said a word since he pulled him from the water. Hadn't cried, hadn't screamed, just sat in that boat, staring, barely breathing. Sam wanted to say something, anything, but the words stuck in his throat. How was he supposed to tell Monica that Frank had done this, that his own father had left Elijah to die? The truth burned inside him, but saying it out loud would make it real. "He was in the water," Sam finally said, his voice tight. "Too far out. I pulled him in." It was the truth, but not all of it. Not yet. Monica's hands gripped Elijah's shoulders. "How did this happen?" Her voice was steadier now, but her eyes were locked. Onto Sam's, demanding answers. Sam hesitated. If he told her the truth, there was no going back. The village would know. His father would know. And Sam had no idea what Frank would do if he was backed into a corner. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. Frank didn't make mistakes. He did things on purpose. He had always been cruel, but this was something else. Elijah shifted slightly in his mother's arms, his breathing still shallow, but his fingers weakly clutched the fabric of her dress, grounding himself. He was alive, barely, but alive. "He fell," Sam muttered, hating himself for saying it. It wasn't a lie, not exactly, but Monica's sharp gaze didn't waver. She knew there was more. Lily, too young to understand the weight of what had happened, reached out and touched Elijah's hand. "You're cold," she whispered, her small fingers brushing against his. Elijah blinked, as if he had only now realized she was there. His lips parted again, but instead of speaking, he let out a weak sob, one that barely made a sound. It was like something inside him had finally broken. Monica pulled him closer, rocking him slightly, whispering reassurances Sam couldn't hear. He turned away, his stomach twisting. He had done the right thing, saving Elijah, but now he was standing in the wreckage of it all, trying to piece together what came next. The village didn't know what Frank had done. Not yet, but Sam did, and the weight of it crushed him. His father, the man who had raised him, had just tried to kill a boy, had done it without hesitation, without regret. Sam had always known Frank was hard, but now he saw him for what he truly was, a monster. He clenched his jaw, breathing hard through his nose. This couldn't be ignored, not pushed aside. He had saved Elijah today, but if he did nothing, what about tomorrow? What about the next time Frank decided someone was a burden? Sam turned back toward the shore, his chest tight. He knew where his father would be, and he knew one thing for certain. This time, he wasn't going to stay silent. Sam slammed the door behind him, his breath ragged, his fists clenched so tightly that his nails dug into his palms. Frank sat at the wooden table, gutting a fish with slow, methodical strokes, as if nothing had happened. The knife sliced through the flesh with practiced ease, the old man's hands. Steady, his face unreadable. He didn't even look up. Sam's chest heaved, anger and disbelief boiling beneath his skin like a fire that refused to die. He had imagined this moment 100 times on the way back, had rehearsed the words in his head, but now, standing there, staring at the man he had called his father his entire life, all he could feel was disgust. "You left him to die." The words came out raw, cracked and trembling, but they filled the room like a thunderclap. Frank's hand stilled for just a fraction of a second before he continued his work, gutting the fish, scraping the blade along its bones. "What the hell are you talking about, boy?" he muttered, still refusing to meet Sam's eyes. Sam took a step forward, his jaw tightening. "Elijah, I saw you. I followed you. I watched you throw him overboard like he was nothing." His voice broke slightly, but he didn't care. He wanted Frank to hear it, to feel it. "And then you just left. You didn't even look back." Frank exhaled sharply through his nose, finally setting the knife down. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his fingers together as if the blood of the fish had somehow stained them. "You don't know what you saw," he said coolly. "That boy, he ain't my responsibility. I gave him work, gave him food. And what do I get in return? A damn leech. Always taking, never giving back enough. You think the world owes people like him something, boy? It don't." His tone was calm, too calm, and that only made Sam's rage burn hotter. He had expected some twisted excuse, maybe even a lie, but this, Frank wasn't even pretending to regret it. Sam's hands shook as he pointed toward the door, his voice rising. "He's a kid, you bastard, a kid, and you threw him into the ocean like he was trash." His vision blurred at the edges, his heart hammering so hard it hurt. Frank scoffed, shaking his head as if Sam was being ridiculous. "You don't understand the way things work. That boy was weak, and weak don't last. That's just life." His tone was flat, almost bored, as if explaining something obvious to a child. "It was him or me, and I ain't about to be the one drowning." Sam let out a short, bitter laugh, his hands now gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. "That's a lie," he spat. "You weren't drowning. You weren't even struggling. You had every chance to help him, and you chose not to." The weight of that truth settled between them, thick and suffocating. Frank's jaw tightened, his fingers flexing against the wood. For the first time, he looked at Sam, not as his son, not as a boy he could mold, but as something else, something unmovable. "You don't get to judge me, Frank," said his voice low, dangerous. "You think you know everything? You don't know what it takes to survive. You don't know what it means to make the hard choices." Sam shook his head, stepping back, his stomach twisting with disgust. "No, I don't, because I'm not a monster." The words hit Frank like a physical blow. His eyes darkened, his fingers twitching as if itching to grab something. Maybe the knife, maybe Sam himself. But Sam didn't flinch. He didn't care anymore. "I don't care what excuses you have," Sam continued, his voice steady now, ice cold. "I saw who you really are today, and I'll never see you as my father again." Frank's mouth opened slightly, but nothing came out. For the first time, the old man looked uncertain, his confidence cracking just enough to show something beneath it, something hollow. Sam took one last look at him, the man who had raised him, the man who had once been his whole world. Then he turned and walked away, and this time it was Sam who didn't look back. Frank's hands trembled as he uncorked the bottle, the sharp scent of cheap whiskey hitting his nose before he took a long, burning swig. He sat hunched in the center of his small fishing boat, rocking with the steady push of the waves. The village lights had long disappeared behind him, swallowed by the darkness of the sea. He had rowed aimlessly for what felt like hours, pushing himself further from shore, further from the weight pressing down on his chest. But no matter how far he went, He couldn't outrun it. The memory clung to him like salt on his skin. The boy's wide, desperate eyes, where his arms had flailed against the water, the sound of his voice screaming his name. "Please, don't leave me here," Frank growled under his breath, shaking his head violently, as if the force of it alone could silence the voice that had been echoing in his skull since that moment. He took another drink, the liquor scorching its way down his throat. He had done what needed to be done. That's what he kept telling himself. The boy was a burden, a leech, weak. Weak things didn't survive in this world, and he had only sped up the inevitable. But if that was true, then why did his hands feel so unsteady? Why did the pit in his stomach refuse to settle? He had killed plenty of things in his life. Fish, birds, animals that wandered too close to the traps. It was just survival. It was just the way of things. But this wasn't the same, was it? No matter how much he tried to convince himself. Otherwise, it wasn't the same. Because Elijah had been alive, looking right at him, pleading, and Frank had made the choice. "You don't get to judge me." He had told Sam that, spat it right at his son's face. But Sam had judged him anyway. Sam had looked at him like he was filth, like he wasn't worth a damn. And the worst part, Frank couldn't even blame him. The boat swayed harder, a sudden jerk pulling him slightly forward, and his grip on the whiskey bottle slipped. It tumbled across the floor, rolling until it hit the edge of the boat, spinning slowly in place. Frank cursed, reaching for it. With sluggish hands, but the movement knocked him off balance. He lurched to the side, his boot catching on the damp wood, and suddenly the world tilted. A rush of cold stole the breath from his lungs as he plunged into the blackness below. His body hit the water with a force that sent shockwaves. Through his chest, his limbs instinctively thrashing. He surfaced with a gasp, his fingers clawing at the sides of the boat, but the wood was slick, the edge just out of reach. He kicked hard, trying to hoist himself up, but his soaked clothes weighed him down. The whiskey clouding his mind, dulling his reflexes. He reached again, his nails scraping against the boat's side, but it drifted just beyond his grasp, rocking slightly as if mocking him. No, 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 no. His breath came faster, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was wrong. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had spent his entire life on the water. He knew how to handle himself, knew how to swim, but the sea didn't care about what he thought he knew. His boots dragged at him, pulling him deeper with every frantic movement. He kicked them off, but the panic had already set in, creeping up his spine like icy fingers. He had seen this before. He had watched men drown, their arms flailing just like his, their heads dipping beneath the surface longer each time, their gasps turning into gurgles. He had watched Elijah do the same thing. Elijah. The name hit him like a punch to the gut. This was what the boy had felt. This was what he had done to him. The realization sent a fresh wave of terror through him. He had abandoned that kid, left him to the mercy of the ocean, and now the sea had come for him. He kicked harder, his muscles burning, but the water refused to let him go. The boat drifted further away, slipping into the shadows. Frank's arms ached, his strength fading with each passing second. His head dipped under, water rushing into his mouth, filling his throat. He sputtered, gasping, but the sea pulled him back down. The panic turned to something colder now. Acceptance. This is it. He had been so sure that Elijah would die here, in this very same way. But Elijah had survived. He had made it back. And now it was Frank who was drowning, alone, forgotten, and there was no one left to save him. "There's something in the water." Sam's voice was tight, his grip on the oar faltering for just a second as he squinted into the distance. Elijah, still weak, turned his head slowly, his body aching from the lingering exhaustion of his own struggle against the sea. The rowboat rocked slightly as Sam adjusted his position, his hands gripping the oars with renewed tension. Then he saw it too, the shape of a boat drifting aimlessly, its occupant nowhere in sight. A flash of movement just beneath the waterline. Then an arm, Elijah's breath caught in his throat. It was Frank. His body twisted, his hands barely staying above the surface, his head bobbing erratically as he kicked, his strength fading with each desperate second. He was drowning, just like Elijah had been. The weight of it settled in Elijah's chest like a stone. He could let him go. He could sit there, watch as Frank slipped beneath the waves, swallowed by the same fate he had intended for Elijah. No one would question it. No one would cry for him. It would be justice. His fingers curled into fists, his jaw clenching as his mind raced. But then something else surfaced, something deeper than the pain, older than the hate. The thought of what it had felt like, gasping for air, lungs burning, knowing no one was coming. The helplessness, the sheer terror of it. He had been there, and he couldn't let someone else die that way, even if that someone was Frank. Elijah let out a shaky breath, then met Sam's eyes. "We have to get him," he said, his voice low but firm. Sam didn't speak, but Elijah saw the flicker of hesitation in his eyes. Sam had seen what Frank had done. He had confronted him, stood against him, watched him leave a child to die, and now fate had thrown the old man into the same hell he had created. But Sam didn't argue. With a sharp nod, he dug his oars into the water, rowing toward the struggling figure. As they approached, Frank thrashed, his movements weaker, more frantic. His face was pale, his mouth open in a strangled gasp, but when he saw them, something flickered in his eyes. Shock, confusion, maybe even fear. "Help!" he choked out, his voice hoarse, barely more than a whisper. His hands reached toward the boat, but they barely stayed above the surface. Elijah hesitated for only a moment before reaching over the side. His fingers wrapped around Frank's thick, calloused wrist, slick with seawater, the same hand that had shoved him into the ocean. Frank flinched slightly at the touch, as if even now he couldn't believe this was happening. Then Sam grabbed the back of Frank's shirt, his grip firm, his face unreadable as he helped Elijah heave him up. Frank was heavy, his body sluggish with exhaustion, and for a moment it seemed like they wouldn't be able to lift him. But then, with a final, strained pull, they managed to drag him into the boat, his soaked body hitting the wooden boards with a dull thud. Frank lay there gasping, coughing up seawater, his whole body shaking. He didn't speak. He just stared at the sky, chest rising and falling unevenly. Elijah sat back, his own breath heavy, his hands trembling as he wiped them on his damp clothes. Sam watched Frank for a long moment before exhaling sharply and looking away, his expression unreadable. They had saved him, the man who had nearly killed them both, the man who had spent his life treating Elijah like he was worth nothing, and now he owed his life to the very people he had tried to destroy. Frank finally turned his head slightly, his eyes locking onto Elijah's. There was no anger there, no fight left in him, just something hollow, something broken. Elijah didn't look away. He let Frank see him, let him understand exactly what had happened. He had been given a second chance, not because he deserved it, but because Elijah had chosen to be better than him. Frank sat on the edge of the dock, his hands limp on his knees, staring at the water as if it held the answer to a question he couldn't form. His clothes were still damp from the ocean, his skin cold despite the heat that wrapped around the village, but nothing could thaw the weight pressing against his chest. He had survived. He wasn't sure if he deserved to. The news had spread fast, faster than he could have prepared for. He hadn't even made it off the boat before the whispers started, turning to murmurs, then to accusations spat with open disgust. The village knew. Every man, every woman, every damn child. They knew he had left Elijah to drown. They knew he had failed, not just as a fisherman or a worker, but as a man. And now there was nowhere to hide. Sam stood a few feet away, arms crossed, jaw tight, his face unreadable. Frank hadn't spoken to him since the boy had pulled him out of the water, since he had looked down at his father like he was something less than human, a stranger. Maybe he was. You think they'll ever forget? Sam's voice was steady, cold, sharper than Frank had ever heard it. He didn't flinch. He didn't look away. Frank exhaled slowly, dragging a hand over his face. "People forget a lot of things," he muttered, but even he didn't believe it. Sam let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking his head. "Not this. Not what you did." He stepped forward, his shadow stretching across the dock. "I want you to hear me, and hear me good." Frank finally looked at him, the sight of his son like a fresh wound that wouldn't close. "You're dead to me." The words cut sharper than any knife Frank had ever held. Sam didn't stay to see the damage. He turned and walked away, leaving Frank alone with nothing but the sound of the waves and the weight of what he had lost. Elijah watched from a distance, standing just outside the doorway of his small home. He had seen the way the village turned its back on Frank, the way the people who once tolerated him now crossed the street to avoid him. He had heard the insults, the threats muttered just loud enough for Frank to catch. And yet, despite it all, Elijah felt nothing. No satisfaction, no vengeance, no joy in seeing Frank broken, just an overwhelming certainty that none of it mattered anymore. Frank's hatred had almost taken his life, but it hadn't, and that was all that mattered. He had survived. Not because Frank allowed it, not because the village had come to his rescue, but because he had fought. And now Frank was the one drowning, but this time there was no one left to pull him out. Monica stood beside Elijah, her hands gentle on his shoulders. "You did good," she murmured, her voice full of something deeper than pride, understanding. She knew what it meant to choose compassion over revenge. She had done it every day of her life. Elijah looked up at her, then at Lily, who clung to his hand as if afraid he'd disappear again. He had a home. He had a family. And that was more than enough. He turned away from the dock, from the man who had once held power over him. That power was gone now, reduced to nothing but a ghost of a cruel past. Elijah didn't need to forgive Frank. He didn't need to hate him either. He just needed to live. Frank didn't move from the dock. He sat there. As the sun dipped lower, the village behind him growing quieter, colder. No one came to him. No one called his name. He had spent his life believing that strength meant taking what you wanted, pushing others down so you could rise higher. But now, at the end of it all, he was the only one left, sinking, and this time there was no one to save him. And that's the end of this chapter. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to Golden Stories, and let us know your thoughts in the comments. Got a friend who'd love this tale? Share it with them. More thrilling stories are coming soon. Stay tuned.